Welcome to the Tools for Traders training session. Tonight's session will be on optimized settings files and their use and how to set them up. Ripper, have at it.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we're going to be talking about OSF files and the different things you can do with OSF files. OSF files are, as far as we know, something that's unique to the tools produced by S&D Software. So what exactly is an OSF file? Well, OSF stands for Optimized Settings Files. And basically, it's a way for chart tool and the session tool primarily to store and retrieve settings. Now, some of the other tools, such as the Trade Finder and the Pattern Finder, can use settings from OSF files, created by the chart tool and intended for use by the chart tool. They don't create any OSF files themselves, but they can read the ones for the chart tool and pull out relevant settings, such as things about how to find acceptable patterns for each of the different pattern types. In the case of the Trade Finder, how to turn acceptable patterns into zones and how to manage those zones. And this allows you to keep these tools in sync with the chart tool so that the Trade Finder and the Pattern Finder operating in a radar screen and the chart tool operating in the chart analysis window can all be using the same settings when they're evaluating the same market on the same interval, is really what it comes down to. Now, there are two flavors of OSF file. There are project OSF files, and these are created and distributed by S&D Software and other approved sources. And you can tell these apart from other OSF files because they all begin, or their names all begin with pro. They'll be pro underscore, and then information about what market or interval that OSF file is intended to be used on. Now, the other flavor of OSF files is personal OSF files. And these are things you can actually create yourself. Both the chart tool and the session tool will let you create personal OSF files. So if you have a particular set of settings that you like for a given market, you'll be able to save those into an OSF file. And you'll be able to set up the tools to use that OSF file automatically whenever you go to the particular market or interval that you've associated with that OSF file. Now, as I just mentioned, OSF files can be associated with a market or an interval or a combination of the two, or none at all. And when they're associated with none at all, then they essentially act as a sort of replacement for the built-in defaults. But when you associate them with a market or an interval or both, that association is kept in the OSF file, and it's actually reflected in the OSF file name. So when you actually look at your OSF files in a given directory, you can tell quickly what markets and what intervals those files are associated with. And that association, that linking, that basically tells the tools where they can use that particular OSF file. So for instance, if you've gone and created an OSF file for IBM on a 20-minute interval, that information will be stored in the OSF file. You've linked that OSF file to IBM on a 20-minute interval. And the tools then will only use that OSF file when you are looking at IBM on a 20-minute interval. And that's only if you told the tools to actually use OSF files. By default, OSF files are disabled. You need to actually turn that on. So if you turn that on, when you go to IBM on a 20-minute interval, the tools that use OSF files will search the specified directory, and this is another setting you can change. They will look for an OSF file that matches IBM on a 20-minute interval, and if they find it, they will use that automatically, seamlessly. So if you do a lot of back testing and you come up with settings that produce the best results for a series of different markets, you can put those settings into OSF files, tell the tool to automatically load the OSF files when it finds them. And then as you switch from market to market, the tools are going to be automatically looking for these files. And when they find them, they'll automatically use those settings that you've determined to be the best. And this will all happen seamlessly, so you don't have to worry about it. Now, again, in the first example here, we had linked an OSF file to both a symbol and an interval, and that was IBM on a 20-minute interval. You can link an OSF file to just a symbol. For instance, the SPY. And since there's no interval linked, then we'll be able to use that OSF file on any chart of SPY, regardless of what interval that may be. Alternatively, you can link an OSF file to an interval with no market. And then anytime you go to that particular interval, like a 15-minute interval here in this example, those settings can be used, regardless of what symbol you're looking at. And then finally, you can associate the OSF file with nothing, which means that it can be applied to any market on any interval. Now, there's some rules that we'll get into a little later that tell the tools which OSF file it should use if multiple OSF files are available for the chart it's looking at. Now, for a lot of the things here, we'll be using the chart tool as an example. But this is equally going to apply to the session tool. And for items where we're reading OSF files, it will apply to the other tools as well, such as the trade finder and the pattern finder. So let's start by looking at the OSF files for the chart tool. Now, the chart tool has a lot of settings, but those settings end up being divided into three groups. There's going to be functional settings, which control things like how it's finding patterns, how it determines whether a pattern is acceptable to be turned into a supplier demand band, how supply and demand bands are managed, how swings are found, how impulse and corrective moves are found, all of that functional stuff. And this settings group is called the rules group because it contains mostly rules that tell the tool how to do something. The second group contains display settings. And so it's going to have all the things about, if we're drawing a line on the chart, how thick should it be? What color should it be? What style? What level of transparency? If we're putting a label onto something, what font to use, what color, what transparency, what size, all that kind of stuff. Everything that controls the look and the feel, I guess you could call it. And we call this the skin group because that apparently is a common name among gamers for this kind of these kind of settings. And it's a lot shorter than trying to call it the look and feel group or something like that. So we call that the skin group. The last group of settings for the chart tool was the miscellaneous group. And this is comprised of things that don't really fit cleanly into the other groups. Things like buffer sizes, log settings, the settings for a band test, all that kind of stuff that doesn't really fit into the functional settings or the display settings cleanly. And so that is the miscellaneous group. Now, while there's no limitation on the settings that can be recorded in an OSF file, by convention, each of these settings group is going to have its own OSF file. And we set it up that way so that you can, for instance, change the look and feel of what's going on the chart tool without affecting the rules or the miscellaneous settings. Or if you like the way the tool was set up and the way things look, but you want to change the rules, you can go and change the rules without affecting the way things are displayed. So by breaking the settings up into these three groups, it gives us the ability to selectively change, some of the groups without affecting the others. Now, one thing I'll point out here is that an OSF file may contain values for all of the settings in a group. And that's actually the normal case. But it's also possible to create OSF files that contain just a subset of the settings in a group. We call that a delta OSF file. And OSF files created in that way are intended for layering. And most people are not going to use layering. But if you're doing a lot of back testing, odds are good you'll want to use the layering. And that's one of the things that it was created to help with. So we'll talk a bit later about how to create Delta OSF files. And we'll talk about some of the cases where layering is useful. There's a lot of complex things you can do with the OSF subsystem. And so until you really understand it and understand how it works, I would recommend keeping it simple. And, if you're going to use OSF files, use complete OSF files so that all the settings for a table are saved in the OSF file. And you know exactly what you're going to get when you apply an OSF file to a chart. Now, the session tool OSF files, these are very similar to the chart tool OSF files. Except for the session tool, we really only have two settings groups. As with the chart tool, we have a functional settings group, and we call that the rules group, just like we did for the chart tool. We also have a display settings group, and we call that the skin group, just like we did for the chart tool. And again, just as with the chart tool, it's set up the same way. Each of those groups is going to have its own OSF file. And the OSF files for the session tool are pretty much, the same. They're the equivalent of what you have for the chart tool. So you're going to have one OSF file for each of those settings groups, and you can have both complete OSF files and Delta OSF files. So if you have OSF files out there, how does this fit in with the way the tool gets its settings? How does the tool determine what settings to use when it's getting when it's going to process a chart. So we have what we call the OSF process. And this is the startup process, I guess you could call it. When the tool is started on a chart, these are the steps it's going to go through. And again, we'll use the session tool as an example here, but we'll mention the others fairly quickly. The chart tool, when it started up, internally, he's going to create 3 tables. One table for each of the settings groups. So there's going to be a table for the rules group. There'll be a table for the skins group. There'll be a table for the miscellaneous group. And these tables are where the settings are going to be stored for that group. We already mentioned that, the session tool has one less, doesn't have a miscellaneous settings group. So he just needs to create 2 tables, one for his rules group, one for his skins group. The trade finder, since he pulls settings from all 3 chart tool groups, he's going to act just like the chart tool, and he's going to create 3 tables internally as well. The pattern finder, he pulls things from 2 of the 3 settings groups used by the chart tool. So he's only going to create 2 tables internally. Now these tables are used to hold the settings for each settings group. And when they are created, the tool is going to fill them in with the built-in defaults. So if there are no OSF files and you haven't changed anything through the customize indicator dialog, then you will get the built-in defaults for all of the settings. And that's what will be used to process the chart. So once he's filled in these tables with the built-in defaults, he is then going to look for project OSF files. And if he finds a project OSF file that can be used on the chart, he's going to load that. That file is going to contain settings. And he is going to take those settings and he is going to overwrite the current entry in the table that corresponds to those settings. Now, project OSF files are normally Delta files, so they only make changes to a few of the default settings. So if he loads a rules project OSF file and there's 10 settings in it, he will go into the rules table and he will write the value from the OSF file into the corresponding entry in the table, overwriting whatever is there. So the value for that setting becomes whatever it is in the OSF file, and all the other values in the table are not touched. So after he has gone through looking for project OSF files and he's loaded those, he then goes and looks for personal OSF files. These are ones that you created. And if he finds any there that he can apply, he'll choose the most appropriate one, and we'll get into that later as to how he actually does that. And he'll take the settings in that personal OSF file, and he will write them into the corresponding locations in the table for that settings group. So if he loads a personal rules OSF file, everything in there will be written to the rules table. And the rules table will be updated to reflect what's in that personal OSF file. And again, most of the time, personal OSF files are complete OSF files, so they'll actually contain all of the settings in the table. And so essentially, he just ends up overwriting the entire table. But it is possible to make Delta personal OSF files. So finally, after the tool has applied the OSF files, and he has these tables filled in now and updated based on the OSF files, he's now going to look at what the user has entered for the settings in the Customize Indicator dialog. Now, as we saw in previous lessons, all the settings that are under the control of the OSF subsystem start out with the word default in them. And what the word default means is take whatever value is in the table at this point in time. So right now, the defaults are what we started with, which was the built-in defaults, and they have been updated by any OSF files that we have found. So whatever is in the table after the last OSF file is loaded, those are now the defaults. So now the tool goes through and he processes all of the settings, looking to see which ones the user manually changed in the Customize Indicator dialog. And then for each one there that the user has changed, he will take the value the user specified and put that into the corresponding location in the appropriate table. And once he's processed all of the settings, then the table is finalized and he can begin processing the chart. So let's try to look at this in a more graphical way here. So again, this is for the chart tool. We can see here the three tables that are created representing each of the settings groups. And we can see that the first thing he's doing during initialization is creating these tables and loading in the built-in defaults. After he's loaded in all the built-in defaults, he then goes and looks for project OSF files. And if he finds any that are applicable, he'll choose the best one. And again, we'll get into the rules for how he does that in a little bit. But if he finds one that's applicable, he will take the settings in there and he will update the appropriate table with those settings. And again, whatever he has, for a setting in the project file, that will replace whatever value is currently in the table for that setting. So after he's done that with the project OSF files, he then goes to the personal OSF files. And again, if he finds any there, that can be applied to this chart. He's going to take the settings from that personal OSF file, and he's going to place the values into their corresponding locations in the tables. Again, replacing whatever was already there. And then finally, you get to the manual overrides. And again, this is things that are entered through the Customize Indicator dialog. And those are, I guess you could say, the last word on the value for a setting. So anything there that the user has entered manually that has the highest priority, I guess you could say, that's going to replace whatever is in the corresponding entry in the tables. And that will be the value that's actually used. So at this point, after we've gone through step 4, we have essentially finalized the settings that are going to be used to process the chart that the tool was running on. Now, item number 5 here, we'll get to this a little later also. Item number 5 comes into play when you want to share settings between multiple instances of the chart tool. So if you have a chart tool running in one window and you have other windows you want to use the same settings as that first chart tool, you can have that first chart tool send his settings to the others. So after that first window completes his OSF process and has finalized the settings that he's going to use for the chart he's working on, he can then send those finalized settings to the other windows. And we'll talk again a bit more about that in a few minutes. Now let's talk about OSF file selection. It's possible to have multiple OSF files that could potentially be applied to a single chart. You know, as an example, if we take IBM on a 15-minute interval, you could have an OSF file that's specifically linked to IBM on a 15-minute interval. You could have another that's just generally linked to IBM with no particular interval. You could have another OSF file that's just generally linked to a 15-minute interval and can be applied to any symbol on a 15-minute interval. And finally, you could have an OSF file that's not linked to any particular symbol or interval. So it could theoretically be applied on any chart. So in a case when you have all of these available, how does the tool choose which one to apply? Because he can only pick one. He can pick one project OSF to apply and one personal OSF to apply for any given table. So like for the rules settings group and the rules table, he can only pick one project rules OSF file and one personal rules OSF file. But you could have 4 project OSF files for rules that are applicable, and you could have 4 personal OSF files for rules that are applicable. So how does the tool go about picking which one? Well, he is going to try to pick the one that matches the best. And we've assigned, I guess you could call it a priority to the different OSF files and the way they're linked. The settings file or the OSF file that is the highest priority is the one that is linked to both a symbol and an interval. Highest priority is one that's linked to a symbol, but not to an interval. And then as you go down further, of course, the next one would be an OSF file that's linked to an interval. And the lowest priority is an OSF file that's not linked to anything. So if we tell the tool, or actually we tell TradeStation to bring up a chart of IBM on a 15-minute interval, and the chart tool is invoked, he's going to find out from TradeStation what the symbol is and what the interval is. And then he's going to go look at the available OSF files and see if he can find one that's linked to the same symbol and the same interval. And that, if he can find one, that has the highest priority. So if he finds a match there, he's done and he's not going to look for others. If he can't find one that's an exact match for the symbol and the interval, he's then going to look for one that's linked to the same symbol, because that would be the next highest priority. And if he can find one that matches there, then he'll take that and he'll stop looking for others. And he's going to continue proceeding down the hierarchy that way. If he can't find one that's matched to the symbol, he'll then try to find an OSF file that's matched to the same interval as the chart being created. And if he finds that, he'll run with it. But if he can't, he'll then see if there are any OSF files that are not linked to anything, in which case then he'll take that. So here's a more graphical representation of that. But again, he's always going to choose the highest priority OSF file that can be applied to the chart that's being created, because that one is going to be the best match. So that's how he chooses which OSF file to apply whenever multiple OSF files are available. Now let's talk about layering of settings. We've already mentioned a few times that an OSF file can contain all the settings for the particular settings group it's for, or it can contain just a subset. So if we intend to layer settings, then we are interested in the case where the OSF files just contain a subset of the settings. So for instance, we'll look at the case that I actually use. I have an OSF file that's set up as a Delta OSF file. So it only contains a few actual entries. And it's set up as a skins OSF file for the chart tool. And in that file, I have some settings which change things like the font sizes and the transparency level of certain of the objects drawn by the chart tool to make it easier on the eyes, so I don't have to go to my Coke bottle glasses. I can just use my normal glasses, but it also makes them show up better over Zoom. And again, it's a Delta file because it contains just a few changes. It doesn't contain the entire, display table in the chart tool, because I don't want to change every setting. I only want to change a few. And over time, the default settings in the chart tool may evolve, in which case, again, I'm just going to be changing a few items, and I'll get the benefit of any other changes, that may have been made as improvements are made to the chart tool over time. But you can take this approach with rules as well. I mean, if you're basically happy with the built-in default rules telling the chart tool how to find patterns and what constitutes an acceptable pattern and how to turn it into a zone and that kind of stuff, but you just want to make one or two little tweaks, like for instance, you prefer band creation method 5 as opposed to the default of band creation method 3. And perhaps you just like one or two other little changes there as well. You can go and make a Delta personal OSF file. And if you want those changes to be applied to everything, then you just associate that file with nothing. It's the lowest priority, a level 0 file is what we call it. And since it's not associated with a particular market or a particular interval, it could be applied to any chart in essence. So any chart where there is not a better OSF file available, it'll be applied. And it'll make our little tweaks so that we don't have to. So you can go further in your layering by having manual overrides on top of your OSF files as well. So you may create some OSF files that make some tweaks to the built-in defaults. And let's say you use those tweaks on most windows, but not all of them. Well, in the windows where you don't use all of those tweaks, you could have a couple of manual overrides in there entered through the Customize Indicator dialog that overrides what's coming from the OSF file. So this allows you to layer your settings. Now, there's another case we'll get to in a little bit when we start talking about sending settings from one window to another, because that opens up some additional layering opportunities. So let's look at the settings that control the loading of OSF files. As you can see, there's not that many. Using OSF files is not complicated unless you want to do some advanced stuff. The first two settings are basically the directories where you want the tool to look for OSF files. So you can have collections of OSF files for doing different things. On your system, you can have them located in different directories to keep them apart so there's no conflicts. And then you can tell the tool which directory to look in for the OSF files that it should actually be using. And you can have separate directories for personal OSF files and project OSF files. Although the way the names are set up, they won't conflict, but it's usually convenient to keep them separate. Now, the next setting allows you to use OSF files that have expired. It is possible to create OSF files that have an expiration date. This is something that's almost never used, but it is possible. Let's say, for instance, you have an OSF file that takes advantage of seasonality. And when the particular season it's targeted at is over, you don't want to be using that OSF file anymore. So it's possible to go in and associate an expiration date with that OSF file so that once the season it's intended to be used for is over, it will no longer be used. But by the same token, you can go and override that behavior and tell the tool to disregard the expiration date. Now, this is false by default, so the tool will honor expiration dates should you have one. Now you can also see that the settings here are normal TradeStation settings. So these settings are not part or are not under the control of the OSF subsystem because they themselves control the OSF subsystem. So these are normal, TradeStation settings here. And so all of these are true and false. True activates the feature, false disables it. Now, the next group of settings, these just tell the tool what kind of OSF files you're interested in, which ones it should load. And you have a separate setting for your project OSF files, as well as, for your personal OSF files, so you can distinguish between them. But these are broken up by the different settings groups. And since this is for the chart tool, we have the 3 settings groups. And since you have the 3 settings groups for your project OSF files, as well as for your personal OSF files, you end up with the 6 settings. But again, if you're only interested in loading, personal rules OSF files, you could turn on just the one setting. Oh, doggone it. What happened here? I hate this program. Okay, so you could just go in and say, load my OSF rules file, set that to true. And then he would only go looking for personal rules OSF files. So this gives you control over what OSF files he's looking for. Now, creating OSF files is pretty easy also. Again, not a lot of settings here. The first setting governs your association between the OSF file and a market and an interval. So right now you can see the default is level 3, which is going to associate the OSF file being created with the market and the interval of the chart that this is being taken from. So when he goes and creates this OSF file, he's going to be writing out the settings that are in use on the current chart. And then he will associate that OSF file with the market from the current chart and the interval from the current chart. But you can go and change that association. Up here, you can see that you can create it. You can associate it with just the symbol in use on the chart, or just the interval of the chart, or none of the above. Now, the next setting, if you actually want to use an expiration date, this is where you would put it. The exact format for that is listed in the manual. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but like I said, it's something that's rarely used, but it is available for those who have a need. And then over here, we have our settings that tell the tool what to create. And these files will be created in the directory that you use for reading OSF files from. We specified that in the last slide, the first setting on the last slide. We can go back there and see that. Say right up here. So if you create an my OSF file, which is a personal OSF file, it's automatically going to be created in whatever directory you have specified here. And this directory is used for both loading as well as creating OSF files. So if we want to create a rules OSF file, Basically, this is going to be the rules table, the rules setting group. We would set this setting, create rules OSF file to true. So now he's going to create a rules OSF file, and it's going to be a complete rules OSF file. He's going to dump the entire table. And if you wanted to create a skins OSF file, we would set this setting to true here, create skins OSF file. And again, that will create a complete OSF file with the entire table, the entire settings group. And of course, for miscellaneous, it's the same thing, create miscellaneous OSF file. That's going to create a complete OSF file. Now, if you want to create OSF files that are intended for layering, you don't want them to contain the entire table. Then what you're going to do is, in addition to telling him to create whatever OSF file you want for whatever particular settings group it is, you'll also tell him to create a delta rules, a delta file. So if we're going to create a rules OSF file, we need to set create rules OSF file to true. Now we're going to get a complete OSF file. And then if we say create delta rules OSF file, then we will get a delta rules OSF file instead of a complete one. Now, how does he decide what goes into the delta rules OSF file? Well, what goes in there is the manual overrides that you've made. The settings you have changed through the customize indicator dialog. So the idea is you're going to start with a fresh chart. You're not going to be loading, any OSF files. You're going to go in, you're going to make your changes manually through the customize indicator dialog. And then you'll go and create the OSF files, and you'll turn on the create delta option. And then you'll get an OSF file that contains just the manual changes you made. And so you can control exactly what goes into that delta OSF file. So if you have 10 changes you want to make, then you would set those up manually, create the delta OSF file, and it would contain just those 10 changes. And then that file can be used for layering, because if it's applied, it's only going to change those 10 entries in the settings group it's associated with. All the other items in that settings group will be left alone. So these are all the settings involved in creating OSF files. There's not that many. And the settings involved in using OSF files we saw before, there's not that many of those either. So let's start talking about sending and receiving settings from one chart tool to another. Now, the chart tool and the session tool both have this capability. And the way it's normally used, again, is to send settings from one chart analysis window to another. So you're going to have one window, which is going to be the sender. And the sender is going to place the settings that he actually uses to process the chart in his window to other chart tools in other windows, which are going to be receivers. Now, the way this takes place is that the sender will take his settings and he will package them up as OSF files. And he's going to package them up as project OSF files. And he is going to create something called a global dictionary. And a global dictionary has to have a unique name. So the user will specify the name to use. And this allows you to actually have multiple senders working at the same time. Now, a receiver is going to be a chart tool or a session tool that's told to look at a specific global dictionary for settings. And you'll be able to tell the receiver what kind of OSF file to expect there, or what kind of OSF file you're interested in. So if we're dealing with a chart tool sender is going to put 3 OSF files into his global dictionary. He's going to put a rules OSF file, a skins OSF file, and a miscellaneous OSF file. The receiver can be told to look at the global dictionary being created by the sender, and he can be told to accept all 3 OSF files that he finds there, or you can tell him to just load a specific 1 or 2 if you wish. But the receiver needs the name of the dictionary to look at. Now, a sender cannot be simultaneously a receiver, and a receiver can only look at one global dictionary to pull settings from. So those are some limitations that we have imposed on the system. Now, when the receiver pulls the settings out of the global dictionary, again, he's going to treat those as if they were a project OSF file, which means that he can go out afterwards and look for personal OSF files. And those personal OSF files could be Delta OSF files, so that he can then take the settings from the sender and make tweaks to them. He doesn't necessarily want to change them all. He just wants to change 1 or 2 items. Then, of course, he can have his manual overrides, which can then be applied on top of what he got from the sender, as well as any OSF files he's loaded to modify what he got from the sender. So you have an opportunity for layering here and have some additional layers than what you would have normally. Let's look at this graphically. So in this example, we have 2 senders. The first sender is creating a global dictionary called CT1 for Chart Tool 1. The second sender is creating a global dictionary called Chart Tool 2 or CT2. And that way they can both put their settings out there into the global dictionary space without conflicting. So for each of the senders, after they have completed their OSF process and have the final settings that they're going to use to process the chart they're working on, they will package up those settings and put those into the global dictionary. Now, the receivers the user is going to tell each receiver which global dictionary they should go and pull their settings from, and which of the OSF files that was placed out there by the sender should be pulled down and used. And so we see here, receiver 1 was told to go to Global Dictionary CT2 and pull just the rules OSF file. Receiver 2 prefers to go to CT1, and he is going to pull both the rules and the miscellaneous OSF files. Whereas receiver number 3 is going to take everything from CT1. And you could have any number of receivers. We have not found any place where TradeStation specifies a limit. And each of those receivers could be pulling different OSF files from the dictionary they choose to look at. Now, I'll mention one other thing about the receivers. When you tell a chart tool or a session tool that it's a receiver, and you tell it what dictionary to go to, it is going to register as a reader of that dictionary with TradeStation. And TradeStation is supposed to provide a signal to let a receiver know when the sender has updated the dictionary. And this way, the receivers can find out about changes that were made, at which point they will cause the chart tool in their window to be restarted so that the chart tool will go through its OSF process and read the new settings and find out what changes were made to the global dictionary by the sender. Now, in the past, we have, in fact, it was on update 56, we had as many as 24 receivers from a single sender without a problem. In update 60, there was a change made by TradeStation, and there were some issues when you had large numbers of receivers attached to a global dictionary. At this point in time, I don't know if that has been fixed. We have not run the big test case again, but we need to go do that and see if TradeStation's fixed that or not. So let's go look at the settings required to do this. Basically, to create a sender, there's only 2 settings. You just have to tell it that it's a sender, and then you just have to give it a unique name for the global dictionary that it should create and put its settings into. And it's really as simple as that. To create a receiver, again, very simple. We again have to give him the name of the global dictionary that we want him to take his settings from, the one that was created by the sender we're interested in. And we just have to tell him what to get from there. And that should be it. So sending settings from one window to another is actually pretty simple. And it can be quite useful depending on what you're doing. You know, if you have a workspace where you have multiple chart windows and they're pretty much using the same settings for the chart tool in all the windows. Then you could go and set up one window as the sender, the others as the receivers. And this way, if you want to make a change, you can just change the one window, which is the sender, and all of the receivers would automatically be updated. You can also set up the receivers so that they can all be slightly different. Let's say for some reason you want to create a workspace where you're looking at, let's say, the same market, but you want to see what the different band creation methods do. So you could have multiple windows, each with a different band creation method, and you could have your master window. And the master window would be the sender. Your receivers would be taking the settings from the master, and then they would have either a manual override, or you could have a Delta OSF file do it. But each one of these receivers would be set up to use a different band creation method. And then you could see the differences between the band creation methods with all other settings being the same. It's a hypothetical example, but it shows what you could do. This actually is useful if you're doing back testing. We'll get into back testing on Friday in Friday's lesson, but using this example where we have, the one sender, multiple receivers, and each receiver, has an override that changes just one setting, in this case, the band creation method. You could go and set up a back test to see which band creation method works best on the market that you're looking at. And you could control the whole back test from the sender window. Now, the other thing about doing it this way is you can actually set it up so that the back tests in the receiver windows are all run at the same time. And that assumes you have enough cores in your machine to do that. But if you have a machine that's got multiple cores in it, you could overlap the band tests to reduce the time of running all the band tests. And so this can improve how quickly you can get your back test results and the amount of back testing that you can actually do. So there are different ways that you can combine the different features to achieve different purposes. So let's go to the tool and actually play some. And I think at this point, we probably want to break the recording.
I was just going to suggest that.